This is Ireland, where the mountains and moors sweep down to the sea. Things don't change much up here, away from it all where the wind blows. And it's where this story starts and ends too. If these things ever end, for this story has that simple truth about it. At the beginning of this century, and this place has seen many a hard winter and forgotten summer's day since then, a little lad used to come up here on his holidays. And here he savored alone the bittersweet longing for desire, which he later called joy, for he knew it to be an experience common in a greater or less extent to all men. This story testifies to that joy and tells of the man who came to know it for what it was, who gave it the familiar ring of truth. That little lad, you see, was C.S. Lewis, destined to become one of the finest champions of the Christian faith, the first man to glance through joy and beyond. These are the Hollywood Hills, rising above the city of Belfast. It was to these hills and their solitude that Lewis used to come. Over there on the horizon are the Antrim Mountains. On a summer's day, a uniform mass of grayish blue. I'm Walter Hooper, and Lewis's private secretary, for a while near the end of his life. You see, I knew him as a kindly old professor and a fine Christian, but it wasn't always that way. Indeed, he described himself in his youth as having been a self-righteous prig, and certainly through the whole of his life, even after conversion, he was never Puritan. The story which we're about to set forth is of that life, and as you'll see, it's an interesting one. The Antrim Mountains were one beauty Lewis enjoyed, but here where I'm standing is another, for here more dearly loved, for it's grassy and dewy here. But down there on the valley floor, it's different. There's a forest of factory chimneys, gantries, and giant cranes rising out of a welt of mist. That's Belfast. But for all this, thoughts of the mountains of Mourne were never far away, and across those fields and the lane over onto the top of the bank and the far side, and the clamour of the city is behind you. This is the plain of Down. Of this view, Lewis wrote,
"And having seen it, blame me, if you can, for being a romantic. For here is the thing itself, utterly irresistible, the way to the world's end, the land of longing, the breaking and blessing of hearts."
Clive Staples Lewis was born in Dudilla Villas on the outskirts of Belfast on the 29th November 1898. His father, Albert Lewis, was of Welsh farming stock, for his father before him had come over from Wales and worked himself up into a successful engineering partnership, McIlwain and Lewis, boilermakers, engineers, and iron ship builders. Lewis was later to describe his grandfather as a self-made man, and certainly Richard Lewis's success in private business was to benefit particularly his youngest son Albert, who received a more elaborate education than had been bestowed on any of his three brothers. He went in 1877, at 14, to Lurgan College in County Armagh, and so to the headmaster there, W.T. Kirkpatrick. It's often interesting how things turn out, and we will hear of Kirkpatrick later on. Safe to say that Albert Lewis was taken under his wing, and after qualifying as a solicitor with distinction, he had a brief partnership and then started a law practice of his own in Belfast, which he conducted with uniform success for the rest of his life. In 1894, Albert Lewis had then another success, for after years of trying, he married Flora Hamilton, the daughter of the local rector, Thomas Hamilton, here at St. Mark's, Dundee, where the Lewises were parishioners. The Hamiltons were of a nobly ecclesiastical stock, and Flora was by any standard a cool-headed woman with a first in mathematics from Queen's College, Belfast. They were married here in St. Mark's at this altar on the 29th August 1894. Flora's father had long held Albert as a favorite, and they regularly journeyed around together. And it makes you wonder, none of the guests, not even the bride or the groom, could have had any idea as to where it was all leading. After a honeymoon, they settled here at Dundee Villas. Their first son, Warren, or Warnie, in this picture of the house and garden, is the little lad seated on the left. He came along a year after the marriage on the 16th June 1895. And 3 years after that, he was followed by Clive Staples, or Jack as he preferred to be called from the age of 4 onwards, shown here standing in white with their mother at the back. In 1905, when Jack was 7, the first great change in his life occurred. His father, with the increasing prosperity, had the new house built. It is a large house called Little Lee, and still stands way out in what was then the country, and the Lewis boys liked it. As Lewis later wrote in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy,
I am the product of long corridors, empty, sunlit rooms, upstairs, indoor silences, attics explored in solitude, distant noises of gurgling cisterns and pipes, and the noise of wind under the tiles, also of endless books. My father bought all the books he read and never got rid of any of them. There were books in the study, books in the drawing room, books in the cloakroom, books too deep in the great bookcase on the landing, books in the bedrooms, books piled as high as my shoulder in the cistern attic, books of all kinds reflecting every transient stage of my parents' interests, books readable and unreadable, books suitable for a child and books most emphatically not. Nothing was forbidden me. In the seemingly endless rainy afternoons, I took volume after volume from the shelves. I had always the same certainty of finding a book that was new to me, as a man who walks into a field has of finding a new blade of grass.
Jack and Warnie were as close as ever, for these were the golden years before all the changes. Big and little brother would set off on their bicycles and seek a way into the rural quiet with thoughts of a chance meeting with a knight in full plate or a leprechaun with a pot of gold. They went, you see, in search of things which had beauty, something strangely absent in their own home.
This absence of beauty, now that I come to think of it, is characteristic of our childhood. And no picture on the walls of my father's house ever attracted, and indeed none deserved, our attention. We never saw a beautiful building, nor imagined that a building could be beautiful. My earliest aesthetic experiences, if indeed they were aesthetic, were not of that kind. They were already incurably romantic, not formal. Once, in those very early days, my brother brought into the nursery the lid of a biscuit tin. which he had covered with moss and garnished with twigs and flowers, so as to make it a toy garden or a toy forest. That was the first beauty I ever knew. What the real garden had failed to do, the toy garden did. It made me aware of nature, not indeed as a storehouse of forms and colors, but as something cool, dewy, fresh, exuberant. I do not think the impression was very important at the moment, but it soon became important in memory. As long as I live, my imagination of paradise will retain something of my brother's toy garden.
The house is indeed spacious, and when the Irish weather drove them inside, this, the little inn room, was their favorite, and the place where they came to make things and to be away from everyone. They both suffered from a manual clumsiness owing to an inherent deformity of the thumb. Rather than make castles and ships, Lewis was forced to describe them. The result was his stories of the imaginary world of Boxen, with characters like James Barr, a bear, Magula, a horse, Viscount Puddipat, an owl, Their Majesties Benjamin VI and Hawke IV, both rabbits. And most endearing of all, there's Lord Big, the Little Master or Prime Minister, who is a frog of powerful personality.
In my daydreams, I was training myself to be a fool. In mapping and chronicling Boxen, I was training myself to be a novelist.
Here's an example of some late Boxoniana with Lewis's own drawings. This particular story was written when Jack was about 10 years old. It was not without difficulty that the hireling Jehu navigated them to the portals of Regency Street Palace. Stepping out, they were conducted by suave domestics to the cloakroom, which, as is usually the case on these occasions, was crowded with knots of whispering guests. Pig, the most courageous person present, led a sort of forlorn hope to the salon, where their majesties were receiving their guests and where stout domestics dispensed tea. The two kings were throwing all their histrionic powers into an imitation of enjoyment, and behind them stood the little master, looking rather worried. The boys kept up a continual flow of conversation. "Good evening, my dear Pig. How are the ships? Ah, Viscount Puddipat, very glad you came. Good evening, your majesties. Ah, my dear little master, I see you've been having busy times in the clique." "Yes," said Big dryly. The Duchess of Pensley came up, a heavy woman whom they all abominated. "Good evening, Duchess. Hasn't Miss Pensley—" "Oh, influenza. I am very sorry to hear that." The Duchess passed on to Big. "Ah, Lord Big, this is a pleasure. How delighted I was to hear that you had had some excitement in politics. It does liven things up so, doesn't it?" "It certainly does," responded the frog brusquely, and engaged a dance. There was so much of his father's conversation in these stories, so much of Victorian smoking rooms and railway stations, morning papers and politics, so much of what, ironically, Lewis later came to detest. But there was no doubting it, that the young Jack Lewis had an outstanding literary ability and an even-tempered rhetoric, which for a young boy amounted to nothing less than genius. This was borne out by an event which happened in 1907, when the family were in preparation for a holiday in France. His brother Warren later wrote of it. The trip to France, our last holiday with our mother, materialized. And there was no doubt, whilst it was under discussion, that Jack first showed that dexterity in repast for which he was later to become famous. Entering the study where my father was poring over his account books, he flung himself into a chair and observed, "I have a prejudice against the French." My father interrupted in a long addition some, said irritably, "Why?" Jack, crossing his legs and putting his fingertips together, replied, "If I knew why, it would not be a prejudice." But a little lad with such a fine intellect didn't spend all of his time inventing stories of an imaginary world. No, there were other times, and increasingly now, when his imagination took him and held him effortlessly and without warning. It was the glimpse of promised genius, the quiet ecstasy of utter givenness which he sought with a desirous innocence. And yet it brought its loneliness, or as Wordsworth, a lifetime influence on Lewis, in his poem The Prelude wrote,
In November days, when vapors rolling down the valley made a lonely scene more lonesome, among woods at noon and mid the calm of summer night, when by the margin of the trembling lake, beneath the gloomy hills homeward I went in solitude, such intercourse was mine. Mine was it in the fields both day and night, and by the waters all the summer long.
And the young Lewis had it too, though his family couldn't have known it. The responsibility was that little lad's alone. He was the one, as the poet went on to say, surprised by joy, impatient as the wind. And although he didn't understand it at the time, it was to be the most important experience of his life.
It will be clear that I was living almost entirely in my imagination, or at least that the imaginative experience of those years now seems to me more important than anything else. The first is itself the memory of a memory. As I stood beside a flowering bush on a summer day, there suddenly arose in me without warning, and as if from a depth not of years but of centuries, the memory of that earlier morning at the old house when my brother had brought his toy garden into the nursery. It is difficult to find words strong enough for the sensation which came over me. Milton's enormous bliss of Eden comes somewhere near it. It was a sensation, of course, of desire, but desire for what? Not certainly for a biscuit tin filled with moss, nor even for my own past. Before I knew what I desired, the desire itself was gone, the whole glimpse withdrawn, the world turned commonplace again, or only stirred by a longing for the longing that had just ceased. It had taken only a moment of time, and in a certain sense, everything else that had ever happened to me was insignificant in comparison. The second glimpse came through Squirrel Nutkin. Through it only, although I loved all the Beatrix Potter books. But it administered the shock. It was a trouble. It troubled me with what I can only describe as the idea of autumn. The experience was one of intense desire, and in the experience also there was the same surprise and the same sense of incalculable importance. The third glimpse came through poetry. I had become fond of Longfellow's saga of King Olaf, fond of it in a casual, shallow way for its story and its vigorous rhythms. But then, and quite different from such pleasures, and like a voice from far more distant regions, there came a moment when I idly turned the pages of the book and found the unrhymed translation of Tainer's Drapa and read, I heard a voice that cried, Balder the Beautiful is dead, is dead. I knew nothing about Balder, but instantly I was uplifted into huge regions of northern sky. I desired with almost sickening intensity something never to be described, except that it is cold, spacious, severe, pale, and remote. And then, as in the other examples, found myself at the very same moment already falling out of that desire and wishing I were back in it.
While Warnie had been sent to school in England as far back as 1905, Jack was still here at home, taking lessons from his governess and his mother. Indeed, he had considerable knowledge of both Greek and Latin by the age of 6. Then, in the winter of 1908, Flora began to feel ill. She was operated on here at home shortly afterwards, and the younger son was never to forget how, after the operation, his father, in tears, came into his room and tried to convey the news that his mother had cancer. Warnie was called home from England, and like two frightened urchins huddled for warmth in a bleak world, their mother, who before had set the even temper of the family, was gradually withdrawn from them. Before her death, she presented each of her sons with a Bible. Louis detested all the fuss and flummery of the funeral, all the subsequent paraphernalia of coffin, flowers, and hearse, with a distaste for all that is public, all that belongs to the collective. He had a boorish ineptitude for formality, but his grief was nonetheless intense.
Grief was overwhelmed in terror. To this day, I do not know what they mean when they call dead bodies beautiful. The ugliest man alive is an angel of beauty compared with the loveliest of the dead. Against all the subsequent paraphernalia of coffin, flowers, hearse, and funeral, I reacted with horror. With my mother's death, all settled happiness, all that was tranquil and reliable disappeared from my life. There was to be much fun, many pleasures, many stabs of joy, but no more of the old security. It was sea and islands now. The great continent had sunk like Atlantis.
Although Albert Lewis's intentions were good, bad advice from the start meant that Lewis's early school life was disastrous. And although everything showed Jack to be bright, he nevertheless hated all the schools he was forced to attend. He was sent here to Wynyard School, or Belsen, as Lewis later called it, in Watford, Hertfordshire, northwest of London. When he was here in 1908, it consisted of a pair of semi-detached houses with outdoor lavatories and was fast sliding into irreversible squalor. But it's changed a bit since then. The school was described by those who knew it as being at once brutalizing and intellectually stupefying to Lewis and the other half-dozen unfortunates who suffered from a crazed headmaster who wielded the cane at the slightest provocation. But after 2 years they won their freedom. The headmaster, Robert Capron, was certified insane, and the school collapsed. There was, however, one good effect to come out of this debacle. The boys were sent regularly to this church, St. John's, still a fine bastion of Anglo-Catholicism. It was here that Lewis for the first time heard the doctrines of Christianity taught by men who really believed them.
As I had no skepticism, the effect was to bring to life what I would already have said that I believed. In this experience, there was a great deal of fear. I feared for my soul, especially on certain blazing moonlight nights in that curtainless dormitory. How the sound of other boys breathing in their sleep comes back.
Without the mediating influence of their mother at home, things were not going too well. Their father, in his attempts to be closer to the boys, only succeeded in stifling the understanding they had once had. So much so that when Lewis later had spent more years in England, the gulf between father and son was every bit as wide as the Irish Sea. The boys were not totally without friends and relatives, and they were always welcome here at Glenmackin House, the home of Sir William Quartus Ewart and his wife, their mother's cousin, Lady Ewart. Sir William was a wealthy industrialist, and this impressive house became for Jack and Warnie a second home of attics, indoor silences, and endless bookshelves. They roamed here as they liked, and in comparison to life at Little Lee, life glided like a barge while their real home bumped like a cart. The boys grew especially fond of the three daughters, Hope, Kelso, and Gundrida, and Jack for the rest of his life thought Gundrida the most beautiful woman he ever saw. After the collapse of Wynyard, Warnie, being old enough, was sent on to Malvern College, one of the finest old schools in England. But for Jack, it was to Belfast and Campbell College, not a mile from Glenmackin House. This was 1910, and he might have liked it more than he did had it not seemed to him, as a day boy, very like living permanently in a large railway station. A little later, he was here at Cherbourg School, perched high upon the beautiful Malvern Hills overlooking Malvern College. It's much the same in appearance now as it was in 1911 when Lewis was here, and for 2 years his education began in earnest, under the kind and sensible guidance of the headmaster, Arthur C. Allen. Meanwhile, terrible harm was coming to the lad from an unexpected quarter. The school matron, Miss G.E. Cowey, well-intentioned though she was, her floundering in the mazes of Theosophy, Rosicrucianism, and Spiritualism, smothered what truth of Christian revelation he had so far received, and left the boy a self-confessed and rejoicing atheist.
Little by little, unconsciously, unintentionally, she loosened the whole framework, blunted all the sharp edges of my belief. The vagueness, the merely speculative character of all this occultism began to spread. Yes, and to spread deliciously to the stern truths of the creed. And, oh, the relief of it. Those moonlit nights in the dormitory at Belsen faded far away. From the tyrannous noon of revelation, I passed into the cool evening twilight of higher thought, where there was nothing to be obeyed, nothing to be believed except what was either comforting or exciting.
But Lewis persevered as a scholar, and at the end of summer term 1913, he won a classical scholarship to Malvern College. Allowed to name his own prize, he was given a copy of Donald A. Mackenzie's Teutonic Myth and Legend. For it was clear now that the vast, cool northernness in Norse mythology was his greatest literary love. Not long after, he was to write 800 lines of a poem, Loki Bound, a pagan tragedy which bewailed the burden of existence imposed on pathetic mankind by the god Odin. And for the moment, this thirst for uncluttered legend was assuaged only by the reading of everything he saw having anything to do with it. But there was something else to it as well. For after 2 years of humdrum, this interest mediated the return of joy, the renaissance of the old bittersweet.
Joy is an unsatisfied desire which is itself more desirable than any other satisfaction. I call it joy, which is here a technical term and must be sharply distinguished both from happiness and from pleasure. Joy, in my sense, has indeed one characteristic, and one only in common with them, the fact that anyone who has experienced it will want it again. Apart from that, and considered only in its quality, it might almost equally well be called a particular type of unhappiness or grief. But then it is a kind we want. I doubt whether anyone who has tasted it would ever, if both were in his power, exchange it for all the pleasures in the world. But then joy is never in our power, and pleasure often is.
This is Malvern College, overlooking the whole of Worcestershire and beyond. It was here Lewis came in September 1913, and if he had been the only pupil, he would have found the library and many of the masters all he could have wanted. But he detested the games, the preparation for public life, the absorbing preoccupation of most of the boys to achieve a place in the school's inner ring, and the fagging, the system by which, without breaking any rules, the older boys could tyrannize the younger ones. In this dormitory, and in one of these very beds, Lewis spent many sleepless and tormented nights. At times exhausted, he pleaded with his father for the whole of the 2 years he was here to have him removed. Until that could take place, however, if it ever would, he clung onto the only life raft he knew, literature, especially the mythology. School organization brought only deeply felt melancholy, and for solace, he retreated into a many-islanded sea of poetry and myth.
I can lay my hand on the very moment. There is hardly any fact I know so well. Someone must have left in the schoolroom a literary periodical, The Bookman. My eye fell upon a headline and a picture carelessly, expecting nothing. A moment later, as the poet says, the sky had turned round. What I had read were the words Siegfried and the twilight of the gods. Pure northernness engulfed me, a vision of huge, clear spaces hanging above the Atlantic in the endless twilight of northern summer, remoteness, severity. And almost at the same moment I knew that I had met this before, long, long ago, in Taina's Drapa. That Siegfried belonged to the same world as Balder and the sunward sailing cranes. And with that plunge back into my own past, there arose at once, almost like heartbreak, the memory of joy itself, the knowledge that I had once had, what I had now lacked for years, that I was returning at last from exile and desert lands to my own country, and the distance of the twilight of the gods and the distance of my own past joy, both unattainable, flowed together into a single unendurable sense of desire and loss. And at once I knew that to have it again was the supreme and only important object of desire.
Though his father had received no unflattering reports of these schools from the elder, more gregarious son Warren, he was now convinced that the younger boy's pessimism was not feigned. The schools were causing him considerable damage, and something had to be done. During the Easter vacation of 1914, his father wrote to William T. Kirkpatrick, who had been his headmaster when Albert Lewis was a pupil at Lurgan College, and asked him to tutor Jack. Kirkpatrick, then 66 and living in the wilds of Surrey, was taking 1 or 2 boarding pupils, and as he had already prepared Warren for Sandhurst, he consented to cram Lewis for Oxford. The one condition he insisted on was that Jack return to Malvern for 1 final term and come to him in the autumn of 1914.
But this wasn't the only pleasant thing of that Easter vacation, and it happened here in this house with the Gaelic name Berna. While at home, Lewis wondered whether he should walk across the road and meet a chap who had long wanted to become his friend, Arthur Greeves. Their families were friends. Arthur was ill, and a message had been sent to say that Arthur would welcome a visit. Lewis rarely accepted such a summons. Everyone in the house knew that. But with the end of his school days in sight, his day-to-day melancholy was for once lifted, and he accepted. One ponders, this meeting could easily never have taken place, and a lifelong friendship would never have been realized.
I found Arthur sitting up in bed. On the table beside him lay a copy of Myths of the Norsemen. "Do you like that?" said I. "Do you like that?" said he. Next moment the book was in our hands. Our heads were bent close together. We were pointing, quoting, talking, soon almost shouting, discovering in a torrent of questions that we liked not only the same thing, but the same parts of it, and in the same way, that both knew the stab of joy, and that for both the arrow was shot from the north. Many thousands of people have had the experience of finding the first friend, and it is nonetheless a wonder, as great a wonder as first love, or even a greater. I had been so far from thinking such a friend possible that I had never even longed for one, no more than I had longed to be King of England. Nothing, I suspect, is more astonishing in any man's life than the discovery that there do exist people very, very like himself.
Lewis had every reason to feel happy and excited about this new friendship. For now his visits home, even during inclement Irish weather, became a pleasure rather than a chore. And yet the two were very different. Greeves, an inarticulate Christian believer, and Lewis, the high-flown, silver-tongued atheist. Lewis was later to write about his friend, "I learned charity from him, but for all my efforts failed to teach him arrogance in return."
And so in the autumn of 1914, he came here to the home of William T. Kirkpatrick, the Great Knock, as the Lewises always called him, in the Surrey village of Little Bookham. The house, which is gone now, was called Gaston's, but the 200-year-old barn still stands. It was here that Lewis's intellect was rescued from what might have been gradual dissipation, and for the rest of his life he was grateful for it. No less a part of his happiness with the Great Knock were Lewis's daily walks through the surrounding countryside. This rural beauty of Surrey effectively ended Lewis's quarrel with England. He said of the Great Knock,
If ever a man came near to being a purely logical entity, that man was Kirkpatrick. The idea that human beings should exercise their vocal organs for any purpose except that of communicating or discovering truth was to him preposterous. The most casual remark was taken as a summons to disputation. I soon came to know the differing values of his three openings. The loud cry of "Stop!" was flung in to arrest a torrent of verbiage which could not be endured a moment longer. Not because it fretted his patience, oh, he never thought of that, but because it was wasting time, darkening counsel. The hastier and quieter excuse ushered in a correction or distinction merely parenthetical, and betokened that, thus set right, your remark might still, without absurdity, be allowed to reach completion. And the most encouraging of all was, "I hear you." This meant that your remark was significant and only required refutation. It had risen to the dignity of error. Refutation, when we got so far, always followed the same lines. Had I read this? Had I studied that? Had I any statistical evidence? Had I any evidence in my own experience? And so to the almost inevitable conclusion. Do you not see, then, that you had no right, etc.? Some boys would not have liked it. To me, it was red beef and strong beer. Here was talk that was really about something. Here was a man who thought not about you, but about what you said. No doubt, I snorted and bridled a little at some of my tossings, but taking it all in all, I loved the treatment. After being knocked down sufficiently often, I began to know a few guards and blows and to put on intellectual muscle. In the end, unless I flatter myself, I became a not contemptible sparring partner. It was a great day when the man who had so long been engaged in exposing my vagueness at last cautioned me against the dangers of excessive subtlety.
But respect flowed mutually between them. And of Lewis, Kirkpatrick, not a man to bandy compliments with the pupil, said in a letter to Albert Lewis of the 16th September 1915 that Clive Lewis was the most brilliant translator of Greek plays he'd ever met. For Lewis, the days at Little Bookham were paradisal without qualification, his letters of the time being charged with the intoxication of literary discovery. And so, with Kirkpatrick's encouragement, on to Oxford.
It is well that there are places of peace and discipline and dreaming and desire, lest we forget our heritage and cease the Spirit's work to hunger and aspire. Lest we forget that we were born divine, now tangled in red battle's animal net, murder the work and lust the anodyne, pains of the beast against bestial solace set. But this shall never be. To us remains one city that has nothing of the beast, that was not built for gross material gains, sharp wolfish power, or empire's glutted feast. We are not wholly brute. To us remains a clean, sweet city, lulled by ancient streams, a place of vision and of loosening chains, a refuge of the elect, a tower of dreams. She was not builded out of common stone, but out of all men's yearning and all prayer, that she might live, eternally our own, the spirit's stronghold, barred against despair.
This is University College, founded in 1280, the oldest of all the 35 colleges in Oxford, where Lewis was now a scholar. When he arrived here on the 26th April, 1917, he was shown to a set of rooms here in Radcliffe Quad, staircase 12, room 5. Those are the rooms he occupied during his entire residence in University College, or Univ, and there's very little changed. In fact, the view from his sitting room is exactly the same, and one which Lewis enjoyed especially. He wrote in a letter to author Greeves,
It is getting to be quite homely to me, this room, especially when I come back to it by firelight and find the kettle boiling. How I love kettles.
But it has to be remembered that this, sadly, was Oxford in wartime. In fact, there were only 12 men in Univ at the time, and in this photograph we see Lewis in the far right-hand corner. There were still chaps swimming in the Charwell, still a few punts on the river, but on the whole, things were greatly changed.
Even though he was a determined atheist at this time, Lewis was never a man to live a lie. And whilst he took a scholarship in the foremost English university, he now felt duty-bound to take his place in her armed forces. He didn't have to sign up. His father actively deterred him from doing so. As an Irish subject, Lewis could easily have gained exemption, but in this, he just felt duty-bound. And so in June of 1917, he moved across the university from Univ to be billeted here in Keble College with the Officers' Training Corps. He shared a room with EFC Paddy Moore. Paddy's home was in Bristol, and his mother and sister came down and took temporary lodgings in Oxford to be near him. This chance meeting was to have great effect on the rest of Lewis's life. The young men grew fast friends, and 2 surviving photographs from those days of tense expectancy show them with our battalion, and again here punting on the river. But it had to come to an end sooner or later. They knew that, and on the 18th September, they learned that there were just 4 weeks left before possibly going to the front. And such was Lewis's feeling of contentment with the whole Moore family that he chose to spend 3 weeks of this in Bristol and only the last few days at home with his father. Albert Lewis was deeply hurt, but the attention which his son had lavished on the Moore family was more extensive than even he knew. The Moores lived here in 56 Ravenswood Road, Bristol. And it was here that Jack and Paddy were to be together for the last time before being shipped to France. Lewis with the Somerset Light Infantry and Paddy with his Rifle Brigade. And it was during this time that Paddy's sister, Maureen, witnessed Lewis and Paddy promise most solemnly that if one or other of them survived the war, the survivor would look after Paddy's mother and Lewis's father. Suddenly, on Thursday, the 15th November, they were ordered to the front following a 48-hour leave, and Lewis immediately sent a telegram to his father. Have arrived Bristol on 48-hour leave. Report Southampton Saturday. Can you come to Bristol? If so, meet at station. Reply, Mrs. Moore's address, 56 Ravenswood Road, Redlands, Bristol, Jack. Mr. Lewis wired back, don't understand telegram. Please write. What was Jack Lewis to think? He thought the worst and crossed to France on the 17th November without seeing him. He reached the front line on his 19th birthday, the 29th November.
I think it was that day I noticed how a great terror overcomes a less. A mouse that I met, and a poor shivering mouse it was, as I was a poor shivering man, made no attempt to run from me. Through the winter, weariness and water were our chief enemies. I have gone to sleep marching and woken again and found myself marching still. One walked in the trenches in thigh gumboots with water above the knee. One remembers the icy stream welling up inside the boot when you punctured it on concealed barbed wire. Familiarity both with the very old and the very recent dead confirmed that view of corpses which had been formed the moment I saw my dead mother. But for the rest, the war, the frights, the cold, the smell of high explosive, the horribly smashed men still moving like half-crushed beetles, the sitting or standing corpses, the landscape of sheer earth without a blade of grass, the boots worn day and night till they seem to grow to your feet, all this shows rarely and faintly in memory. One imaginative moment seems now to matter more than the realities that followed. It was the first bullet I heard, so far from me that it whined like a journalist's or a peacetime poet's bullet. At that moment, there was something not exactly like fear, much less like indifference, a little quavering signal that said, this is war. This is what Homer wrote about.
Lewis didn't find out until later that his friend Paddy was killed in March 1918. And indeed, the war for Lewis was not to last much longer. After capturing a small company of Germans single-handed, which he later claimed was more accident than angry aggression, they weren't really afraid of me, but just walked out with their hands up. He was wounded during the Battle of Arras on the 15th April from an English shell which burst behind him.
He was now to convalesce in a number of cluttered military hospitals. And when he arrived back in London on the 25th May, 1918, he began compiling Spirits in Bondage under the pseudonym Clive Hamilton, a volume of poems which he hoped would be his first step towards poetic fame. For him, more than for many others, Byron's words, I will cut myself a path through this wall or perish in the attempt. I will achieve grandeur but never with dishonor, were despairingly true. Indeed, it was on this that his atheism thrived so vehemently, and what a formidable atheist he was. He wrote in a letter to author Greeves,
You know, I think that I believe in no religion. There is absolutely no proof for any of them, and from a philosophical standpoint, Christianity is not even the best. All religions, that is, all mythologies, to give them their proper name, are merely man's own invention, Christ as much as Loki. Primitive man found himself surrounded by all sorts of terrible things he didn't understand. Thus, religion, that is to say, mythology, grew up. Often, too, great men were regarded as gods after their death, such as Heracles or Odin. Thus, after the death of a Hebrew philosopher, Yeshua, whose name we have corrupted into Jesus, he became regarded as a god. A cult sprang up, which was afterwards connected with the ancient Hebrew Yahweh worship, and so Christianity came into being, one mythology among many. Of course, mind you, I'm not laying down as a certainty that there is nothing outside the material world. This would be foolish.
Did not Lewis remonstrate a little too strongly for a man so certain of his own atheism? Despite the horrors of the war, Lewis spent his spare moments reading the Christian writings of George MacDonald and G.K. Chesterton, and was led to the conclusion that a young man who wishes to remain a sound atheist cannot be too careful of his reading. There are traps everywhere. God is very unscrupulous. To show how stealthy God was in altering Lewis's life and making him the touchstone of faith and common sense to millions of his future readers, and to meet some of the friends who affected his life, one will want to see the second part of Through Joy and Beyond.